up, guys? Mr. P here. Today, we're going to factor perfect square trinomial strategy. Perfect square trinomial, that sounds pretty amazing, doesn't it? Okay, so before we do this, you're going to need to know what a perfect square is. We talked a little bit about that in the difference of square video. So perfect square, remember, is a number or term that can be square rooted so that you don't get a decimal number. So for example, 9 is a perfect square. If you square root it, you get 3. 25 is a perfect square. If you square root it, you get 5. X squared is a perfect square because if you square root it, you get x. Okay? So perfect square trinomials. Perfect square trinomials will look either like this, a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, or like this, a squared minus 2ab plus b squared. Okay, where the first and last terms are perfect squares, right? So just like we did for difference of squares, we can check if these are perfect squares by square rooting them. And if we get a value that is not a decimal, then they're perfect squares. And we also determine our a and b values. Secondly, what needs to be the case is the middle term is exactly twice the product of the square roots of the first and last terms. So in other words, once you find what your a is, once you find what your b is, after you square root your first and last terms, if you multiply them together and then multiply that by the 2, you double it, that's when you have a perfect square trinomial. Okay, and you basically have two options. The last term is always a plus, always a positive there, but the first one could always be a plus or a minus. So you got to identify which version of the perfect square trinomial you have. Okay, and to factor it, again, these are our two different types. And basically our factored answers are, once we figure out what our a and b values are, we just kind of shove them into this little formula here, or this one, depending which version of the perfect square trinomial we have. Okay, our answers are basically going to be like an a plus b squared or an a minus b squared. Super, super easy. Okay, let's get into the first question here. I'm going to keep these formulas on every page here just so we have it as a guide. Okay, the first one. Factor x squared minus 12x plus 36. So first we want to kind of identify if this is a perfect square trinomial. The first guess is you look at your first and last term. So our first term is x squared. We know that is a perfect square. And we look at our last term, it's a 36. And we know that's a perfect square. So we're thinking that this is probably a perfect square trinomial. But we do have to make our final check. So let's find our a and b values, right? So a is the first term in the formula, right? So that means a squared is equal to x squared. A squared is equal to x squared. So that means if we're solving for a, we need to get rid of the square, bring it to the other side, and of course the opposite on the other side would be square root. So if we're solving for a, we square root the x squared, and that's easy, that's just going to be x. Okay? So far, so good. So our a value is equal to x. Let's do the exact same thing for b. So b squared term is the very, very last term. So the 36. It's always going to be a positive number here, but you can ignore the symbol, really. So that means b squared is equal to 36. That means if we were to solve for just b and we square root that, we are going to get just 6. Okay, so that means our b value, just b, is equal to 6. Okay, so far so good. Both our first and our last term are perfect squares because we just checked that here by square rooting both of them. Now we need to make sure that the middle term is exactly a multiplied by b times 2. So that's what we're going to do right now, a little check. Let's get a cool color here. Okay, so check. Check. So we're going to check 2 multiplied by a multiplied by b. And once we solve it, it should be equal to 12 there. Okay, so let's check. So if we do 2 multiplied by a, which is x, multiplied by b, which is 6. Let's do brackets around these things. So 2 times x times 6. If you multiply that all together, you can really only multiply the numbers. So 2 times 6, you end up getting 12. And of course, the x just kind of chills there. So that 12x is the exact same value as our 12x here. So that means for sure this is a perfect square trinomial. Okay, and now we can quickly factor this using the correct formula. So this has the minus as our first plus or minus symbol there. So that means we are going to use the second formula here, the minus version, right? That's the only difference you're looking for, right? One's a plus, one's a minus. So basically we want to fill in a minus b in brackets squared, and that will be our final answer here. Okay, let's do this one in black. So our answer will be bracket. Our a value we know is simply x. So you put x there. We put a minus, right? And we know it's minus because we had the minus version. That's basically the difference here. And then our value of b is 6. And of course, they have a square in that pattern, so we'll put a square there too, which basically means x minus 6 multiplied by itself. But this right here is your final answer here using perfect square trinomial factoring. X minus 6 squared. Let's try another one. We're going to factor 25y squared plus 20y plus 4. Okay, so first you have to check if your first and last terms are perfect squares. So we have a 25y squared, looks like it, and our last term is a 4, so again, looks like it. So that's why we're thinking perfect square trinomials. So this would be equal to our a squared. So let's find what a is equal to then. So a squared equals 25y squared. And if we solve for a, we square root the 25y squared, which will become 5y, right? 25 squared is 5, y squared is y. Okay, so that means that our a value will be equal to 5y. And that also means that that first term is a perfect square. So far, so good. Now we got to check the last term, the 4. Okay, so that is technically our b spot there. So b squared is equal to the 4. So therefore, if we solve for the b value we square root that 4, which we know will be a 2. Okay, so now we know that just b, our value b, is going to be equal to 2. So that is also a perfect square, right? The 4. So now, before we can verify that it's perfect square trinomial and put it into the formula, we have to check that middle term, right? So the middle term has to be equal to a times b multiplied by 2. So we're going to do a little check here. So check. We're literally going to do 2 multiplied by our a value multiplied by our b value. So we're going to do 2. Our a value is 5y. So 2 times 5y. And our b value is times 2. Times 2. And we're just going to multiply this all together in one go. So 2 times 5 is 10. 10 times 2 is 20. And the y, there's no other y's there, so it's just going to stay as 20y. And what do you know? This 20y is the exact same as this 20y. Again, ignore the plus or minus symbol because it could be either version down here, plus or minus. So we just want to make sure that the term itself is the same, and it is. So that means this is definitely a perfect square trinomial. So now this is the plus version. So we're going to use the one up here, this one, and we're going to fill in this spot right here, a plus b squared in brackets, and that's going to be our final answer. So all we got to do is make our brackets, and we know it's going to be a bracket squared at the end there, and we're going to go a plus b, so our a value is 5y, plus our b value, which is just 2. And that is our factored answer here from symbol trinomial. 5y plus 2 all squared. Let's do one more here. One more here. Okay. So like in our other factoring videos, sometimes you need to remove a common factor first before you can factor it using any other strategy. And again, this should be a tip for any type of factoring method. Always, always, always common factor first, because sometimes you need to in order to keep factoring. But at the very least, if you don't, at least it simplifies your numbers and makes them much, much smaller. Okay? So right now, if we were to check if this is a perfect square trinomial, we would look at the 5 and the 20 at the beginning and end, and those are definitely not perfect squares, as they are. But let's see if we can common factor something out of this to make it so. So out of a 5x squared, a negative 20x, and a 20, it looks like we can actually divide out a 5. Okay, so we'll take out a 5 from everything. And if we divide everything by 5, divide by 5, divide by 5, divide by 5, 5x squared divided by 5, we're left with just x squared. Negative 20 divided by 5, we get negative 4x in the middle. And then 20 divided by 5, we get a plus 4 at the end there. Okay, so now we look at our first and last terms. The first term is technically an x squared. We know that's a perfect square. And the last term is a 4. We know that's a perfect square. So we're thinking this is probably a perfect square trinomial. So let's do the full check. So our a value, so our a squared value, would be equal to that first term of x squared. And again, if we solve for just the a, we square root that, we end up getting just x. Okay, so our a value is x. Now let's check the b squared value at the end. So b squared, as is equal to 4. So if we solve for b and square root of 4, we get 2. Okay, so far it's looking like it's a perfect square trinomial. Now we just have to check the middle term and make sure that it's a times b times 2. Again, ignore the positive or negative for now. So we're going to check, I'm going to do it up here this time, check 2ab. So we're going to do 2 multiplied by a, which is x, multiplied by b, which is another 2. And when we put that all together, 2 times x times 2 is going to be simplified to just 4x. And, oh, I erased something here by accident. There should have been a 4 here. I didn't write it properly, sorry. Because negative 20 divided by the 5 was negative 4x there. So our 4x check is the same as the 4x in our bracket there. So that means for sure this is a perfect square trinomial. So now let's go ahead and fully factor this thing. Okay, so this looks like it is the minus version, right? Because that first term was a minus, which means we're going to follow this structure of the minus version. And we're basically going to write an a minus b squared answer. Okay, so our answer will be bracket squared. A value is x. So we're going to go x. Then we want a minus, and our b value is 2. And the last thing we need here that we can't forget, since we took that 5 out at the very beginning, we need to also include that over here on the outside of the bracket. So that right there is our fully factored answer here, 5, and then bracket x minus 2 bracket squared. Okay, so always common factor first if you can. Sometimes you need to, like we did here, or at the very least, it makes your numbers that much easier to work with. Okay, and that is it for this one.